Hijos. How are you doing? Morning. Yeah, okay. I'm just a tad late. I'm still sleepy. So please excuse my sleepy. Today is a reading stream. Sound alerts are turned off. I forgot to turn off redeems. Thank you for reminding me. Alright, there ahead. Thank you for reminding me to turn off my redeems. And good morning to you. Morning. Go what? All good, all good. Just give me a second. Head pads are always okay. I always leave those on. Anyway, let me just. Oh. I'm still very sleepy. As I said, please excuse me. So I will refund you the 5 points, Sean. I hope I can. It's like I can't. Because it triggers on its own. Wow. I shall refund you the head pets then. Okay. Okay. Once again for some reason my tracking is a bit off, so it doesn't properly track my expressions. I don't know why. Well, I gotta figure that out. Okay. Okay. Let's start reading, shall we? You know the drill. Alerts are turned off. Most redeems are turned off. There should be no distracting sounds. I will turn off BGM shortly, and I will react to chat every now and when the time allows, or when I have to take a drink. Speaking of which, I shall drink something before I start reading. Okay, sit back, relax, and let's listen for. Chapter 3. In the pasture. Heidi was awakened early in the morning by a loud whistle. When she opened her eyes, a flood of sunshine was pouring through the round window on her bed, the hay close by, so that everything about shone like gold. Heidi looked around her in amazement, did not know where she was. Then she heard her grandfather's deep voice outside. Everything came back to her mind, where she had come from, and that now she was up on the arm with her grandfather, no longer with old Ursel. Ursel was always cold, so that she liked to sit by the kitchen fire or the stove, chamber. Heidi had been obliged to stay very near, so that the old woman could see where she was, for she was deaf and could not hear her. This had often been very irksome to Heidi, who longed to run outside. So she was very glad when she awoke in her new home, remembered how many strange things she had seen the day before, and what she would see again that day, especially Svenli and Berli. Heidi jumped quickly out of bed, and in a few minutes had put on all that she wore the day before. It was very little. Then she climbed down the ladder and ran out in front of the hut. There already stood the goatherd Peter with his flock. Grandfather was bringing Schwänli and Barley out of the shed to join the other goats. Heidi ran up to him to say good morning to him and the goats. "Would you like to go to the pasture too?" asked the grandfather. Heidi was pleased with the idea and jumped for joy. "But first wash and be clean, or else the sun will laugh at you when it is shining so brightly up there and sees that you're dirty. See, everything is ready for you." The grandfather pointed to a large tub full of water standing before the door in the sunshine. Heidi ran to it and splashed and rubbed until she was all shiny. Meanwhile, the grandfather went into the hut and called to Peter, "Come here, general of the goats, and bring your haversack with you." Peter, surprised, obeyed the call, brought along the little bag in which he carried his meager dinner. "Open it," said the old man, and he put in a large piece of bread and an equally large piece of cheese. Peter opened his round eyes as wide as possible in his amazement, for both pieces were half as large again as what he had brought for his own dinner. "Now in goes the little bowl," continued the uncle, "for the child cannot drink the way you do, right from the goat. She doesn't know how. Make 2 bowls at noon for her. She's to go with you and stay until you come down again. Take care that she doesn't fall over the rocks, do you hear?" Heidi came running up. "Can the sun laugh at me now, grandfather?" she asked eagerly. In her fear of the sun, she had rubbed her face, neck, and arms so vigorously with the coarse towel her grandfather had hung by the water tub that she looked as red as a lobster. Her grandfather smiled. "No, now he has nothing to laugh at," he admitted. "But do you know, tonight, when you come home, you must go in all over, like a fish. For after running about like the goats, you will have black feet. Now, you can march along." So she went merrily up the elm. The wind in the night had blown away the last clouds. The sky was everywhere deep blue, and in the midst stood the sun, shining on the green mountain. All the blue and yellow flowers opened their calyxes and looked up with gladness. Heidi jumped here and there and shouted for joy, for there were whole troops of delicate primroses together, and yonder it was blue with gentians, and everywhere in the sunshine smiled and nodded the tender-leaved golden rock roses. Heidi was so charmed by all these glistening, nodding flowers that she entirely forgot the goats and even Peter. She went far ahead and then off on one side, for it shone red here and yellow there. It enticed her in every direction. Wherever she went, she plucked quantities of the flowers, put them into her apron, for she wanted to carry them all home and put them into the hay in her sleeping room, that it might look there as it did here. So Peter had to look everywhere, and his round eyes, which did not move quickly from one place to another, more work than they could well manage, for the goats were as bad as Heidi. They ran hither and thither, and he was obliged to whistle and shout, and swing his rod continually in order to drive all the stragglers together. "Where have you gone now, Heidi?" called almost angrily. "Here," sounded from some indefinite place. Peter could see no one, for Heidi was sitting on the ground behind a knoll, which was thickly covered with fragrant wild flowers. The whole air around was filled with the sweet odor, and Heidi had never breathed anything so exquisite before. She sat down among the flowers and drew in long breaths of the perfume. "Come along," called Peter again. "You must not fall down over the cliffs. The uncle charged me not to let you." "Where are the cliffs?" asked Heidi without stirring from the place, for every breath of wind brought a sweet odor to the child with increasing charm. "Up there, way up. We still have a long way to go, so come along now." "And up at the very top sits the old robber bird croaking." It availed. Heidi immediately jumped up and ran to Peter with her apron full of flowers. "You have enough now," he said, and they were once more climbing together. Besides, you'll stay here forever, and if you pick them all, you won't have any tomorrow. The last reason convinced Heidi. Besides, her apron was already so full that there was hardly room for more, and there must be some left for tomorrow. So she went along with Peter, and the goats behaved better and hurried along without delay, for they smelt the good herbage in the distance on the high pasture land. The pasture, where Peter usually went with his goats for the day, lay at the foot of the high cliff. The lower part of this was covered with bushes and fir trees, but it rose towards heaven quite bold and steep. On one side of the mountain there were deep chasms. The grandfather was quite right in warning Peter about them. When Peter reached the spot on the heights, he took off his bag and laid it carefully in a little hollow in the ground. He knew that the wind often washed across in strong gusts. He did not wish to see his precious possessions roll down the mountain. Then he stretched himself out on the ground, in sunny pasture, to rest from the exertion of climbing. In the meantime, Heidi had taken off her apron, walled it up tightly with the flowers inside, and laid it close to the lunch bag. Then she sat down beside Peter and looked around her. The valley lay far below in full morning sunshine. In front of her, Heidi saw a great wide field of snow, stretching high up into the deep blue sky. On the left stood an enormous mass of rock, on each side of which a higher tower of bold, jagged crags rose into the azure, and looked very sternly down on Heidi. The child sat as still as a mouse. Everywhere there was great, deep stillness. Only the wind passed very softly and gently over the tender bluebells, the radiant golden rock roses, which were everywhere gaily nodding to and fro their slender stems. Peter had gone to sleep after his exertion, and the goats were climbing among the bushes. She drank in the golden sunlight, the fresh air, the delicate fragrance of flowers. She desired nothing more than to remain there forever. A good while passed in this way, and Heidi had gazed so often, so long at the lofty mountain tops, that it seemed as if they had all faces and were gazing down quite familiarly at her, like good friends. Then she heard above her a loud, shrill screaming and croaking, and as she looked up into the air, the largest bird she had ever seen in her life was flying around on wide, outstretched wings, coming back in wider circles and screaming loud and piercingly over her head. "Peter, Peter, wake up!" cried Heidi at the top of her voice. "See, there's the robber bird! See, see!" Peter jumped up at the call and looked with Heidi at the bird, which was flying higher and higher in the blue sky. Finally, it disappeared over the grey cliffs. "Where has he gone now?" asked Heidi, who had watched the bird with eager scrutiny. "Home to his nest," was Peter's answer. "Is his home way up there? Oh, how lovely to be so high up! Why does he scream so?" asked Heidi again. "Because he can't help it," explained Peter. "Let us climb up there and see where his home is," proposed Heidi. Oh, burst out Peter, uttering each exclamation with more vehement disapproval. "No goat can get there, and the uncle said you must not fall over the cliff." Then Peter suddenly began such a whistling and calling that Heidi did not know what was going to happen. But the ghosts must have understood the sound. One after another, they came jumping down until the whole flock was assembled on the green slope, some nibbling the spicy stalks, others running to and fro, still others amusing themselves by butting one another with their horns. Heidi jumped up and ran around among the goats. It was new and indescribably amusing to her to see how the little creatures leaped about and played together. Heidi made the personal acquaintance of each, for every one had a quite distinct individuality in its own peculiar ways. Meanwhile, Peter had brought out a bag and nicely arranged all four of the pieces of bread and cheese on the ground in a square. the larger pieces on Heidi's side, the smaller ones on his side. He knew just how many he had. Then he took the little bowl and milk, sweet, fresh milk from Schwänli into it, placed it in the middle of the square. Then he called Heidi, but he had to call longer for her than for the goats, because she was so interested and pleased with the varied gamboling and frolicking of her new playmates that she saw and heard nothing else. But Peter knew how to make himself understood. He called till it made the rocks above echo. Heidi appeared. The table he had laid looked so inviting that she danced around it for joy. "Stop jumping. It is time to eat," said Peter. "Sit down and begin." Heidi sat down. "Is the milk mine?" she asked, contemplating with satisfaction the neat square and the bowl in the middle. "Yes," answered Peter, "and the 2 large pieces of bread and cheese are yours too. And when you have drunk all the milk, you can have another bowlful from Schwänli, and then it is my turn." "And where will you get your milk?" Heidi wanted to know. "From my goat, from Schnecke. Go to eating," commanded Peter once more. Heidi began with her milk, and as soon as she set down her empty bowl, Peter rose and filled it again. Heidi broke some of her bread into it. The rest, a piece still larger than all Peter's bread, she handed over to him, with all her large portion of cheese, and said, "You may have that. I have enough." Peter looked at Heidi in speechless amazement, but never in his life had he been able to say such a thing or give anything away. He hesitated a little, for he could not really believe that Heidi was in earnest. She persisted in offering the bread and cheese. When he did not take it, she laid it down on his knee. Then he saw that she meant it for him, seized the prize, nodded his thanks, then made the most satisfactory dinner of his goatherd life. Meantime, Heidi watched the goats. "What are their names, Peter?" she asked. He knew them all well enough. Keep them in his head all the better, because he had little else to store away there. So he began, without hesitation, named one after the other, pointing to each one as he did so. Heidi listened with the closest attention to his explanation. Before long she could distinguish them from one another, call each by name, for they all had their peculiarity, which any one might remember, but it was necessary to look at them closely, and she did this. There was the big Turk, with his powerful horns. He was always trying to butt all the others, and if he came near, most of them ran away and would have nothing to do with their rough comrade. The brave Distelfink, a slender, nimble little goat, was the only one that did not avoid him, but often ran at him 3 or 4 times in succession so swiftly and skillfully that the big Turk would stand still in astonishment, make no further attack, for the Distelfink looked very warlike and had sharp horns. There was the little white Schneehöppli, always bleating so touchingly, so beseechingly, that Heidi went to her again and again, put her arms around her head to comfort. But now the child hurried to her once more, for her mournful young voice was again raised in appeal. Heidi threw her arm around the little creature's neck, and asked quite sympathetically, "What is the matter, Schneehöppli? Why do you cry so?" The goat trustingly pressed close to Heidi's side, and became perfectly quiet. Peter called out from where he was sitting, with frequent interruptions while he took a bite and a swallow. "She does so because the old one doesn't come with her any more. Sold her, sent her to Meienfeld day before yesterday, so she doesn't come up on the Alm any longer." "Who is the old one?" asked Heidi. "Why, the mother, of course," was the reply. "Where's the grandmother?" asked Heidi again. "Isn't any." "And the grandfather?" "Isn't any." "You poor Schneehöppli," said Heidi, drawing the little creature tenderly towards her. "Don't cry so any more, for, you see, I will come with you every day, and then you won't be alone. And if you want anything, you can come to me." Schneehöppli rubbed her head contentedly against Heidi's shoulder, bleated no more. By far the prettiest and cleanest of the goats were Schwenli and Berli, who were decidedly superior in their behavior, but usually went their own way. They especially avoided the obstructive Turk, and treated him with contempt. The animals had begun to climb up to the bushes again, each one after his own fashion, some leaping carelessly over everything, others cautiously seeking out the good herbs as they went along, while the Turk tried his horns here and there, first in one place and then in another. Schwanli and Berli climbed prettily and gracefully, and whenever they found fine bushes, there they stationed themselves, browsed on them. Heidi stood with her hands behind her back, watching them all with the closest attention. Peter, she said to the boy, who had thrown himself down again on the ground. The prettiest of them all are Schwenli and Berli. Of course they are, was the reply. The uncle brushes and washes them with some salt and has the best shed. Suddenly, Peter jumped up and fairly leaped after the goats. Heidi ran after him. She felt that something must have happened. She could not remain behind. Peter ran through the midst of the goats to the side of the mountain, where the rocks descended steep and bare far below, where a careless goat, going near, might easily fall over and break all its bones. He had seen the venturesome Distelfink jumping along in that direction. He reached there just in time, for at that instant the little goat came to the very edge of the precipice. Just as it was falling, Peter flung himself down on the ground and managed to seize one of its legs and hold it fast. Distelfink bleated with anger and surprise, to be held so by his leg, and hindered from continuing his merry course, struggled obstinately onward. Peter screamed, "Heidi, help me!" For he couldn't get up and was almost pulling off Distelfink's leg. Heidi was already there, instantly understood their sorry plight. She quickly pulled up from the ground some fragrant herbs, held them under Distelfink's nose, and said soothingly, "Come, come, Distelfink, you must be sensible. See, you might fall off and break your bones, and that would give you frightful pain." The goat quickly turned around, eagerly nibbled the herbs from Heidi's hand. Meanwhile, Peter had succeeded in getting on his feet. He had seized the cord which held the bell round Distelfink's neck. Heidi seized it on the opposite side. The two together led the runaway back to the peacefully feeding flock. Hello, Cody. Hello, Haruki. Hello, Tsuki. I had pet. When Peter had the goat in safety once more, he raised his rod to beat him soundly as a punishment, and Distelfink timidly drew back, for he saw what was going to happen. But Heidi cried, "No, Peter, no, you must not beat him. See how frightened he is." "He deserves it," snarled Peter, who was going to strike the goat. Heidi seized his arm and cried indignantly, "You shall not do it! It will hurt him! Let him alone!" Peter looked in astonishment at the commanding Heidi, whose black eyes snapped at him. He reluctantly dropped his rod. "You can go if you will give me some of your cheese again tomorrow," said Peter, yielding, for he wanted some compensation for his fright. "You may have it all, a whole piece, tomorrow and every day. I do not want it," said Heidi, with ready assent. "I will give you a good part of my bread too, as I did today. Then you must never, never beat Distelfink, nor Schneehöppli, nor any of the goats." "It's all the same to me," remarked Peter, and this was as good as a promise with him. Then he let the offender go. The happy Distelfink leaped high in the air, then bounded back into the flock. Thus the day had imperceptibly passed away. The sun was just ready to go down behind the mountain. Heidi sat down on the ground again, and silently gazed at the bluebells, the rock roses, glowing in the evening light. And all the grass seemed tinted with gold. Cliffs above began to gleam and sparkle. Suddenly, Heidi jumped up and exclaimed, Peter! Peter! It's on fire! It's on fire! All the mountains are burning, and the big snowfield over there is on fire, and the sky! Oh, see, see! The high cliff is all burning with a beautiful fiery snow. Peter, get up! See, the fire reaches up to the wobber bird. Look at the rocks! See the fir trees! Everything, everything is on fire. It is always so, said Peter good-naturedly, peeling the bark from his rod. But it is no fire. What is it, then? Asked Heidi, running back and forth in order to look on every side, for she could not see enough. So beautiful everywhere. Comes so of itself, explained Peter. Oh, see, see, cried Heidi in great excitement. Suddenly it grows rosy red. Look at the snow and the high, pointed rocks. What are their names, Peter? Mountains don't have names, he replied. Oh, how lovely! See the snow all rosy red, and oh, on the rocks above there are ever and ever so many roses. Oh, now they are turning grey. Oh, 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 it is all gone. It is all gone, Peter. Heidi sat down on the ground. It looked as distressed as if everything was really coming to an end. It will be just the same again tomorrow, explained Peter. Get up. Must go home now. Peter whistled and called the goats together. They started on the homeward journey. Will it be like that every day? Every day when we go to the pasture? Asked Heidi, listening eagerly for some decided assurance as she walked down a mountain by Peter's side. Usually, was the reply. But really tomorrow again? She wanted to know. Yes, yes, tomorrow certainly, assured Peter. Then Heidi was happy once more, but she had received so many impressions, so many things were going around in her mind, that she was perfectly silent until they reached the hut and saw her grandfather. He was sitting under the fir trees, where he had also made a seat. He was in the habit of waiting in the evening for his goats, which came down in this direction. Heidi went straight up to him, followed by Schwendi and Berli, but the goats knew their master in the shed. Peter called out to Heidi, Come again tomorrow. Good night. He was pleased to have Heidi go with him. Heidi dodged back, gave Peter her hand, and assured him that she would accompany him again. Then she sprang into the midst of the departing flock, threw her arms once more around Schneehippel's neck, and said confidingly, Sleep well, Schneehippel, and remember that I will go with you again tomorrow, that you must never bleed so mournfully again. Schneehippel seemed pleased, and looked thankfully into Heidi's face, and then leaped gaily after the other goat. Heidi came back under the fir tree. Oh, grandfather, it was so beautiful, she exclaimed, even before she had reached him. The fire and the roses on the cliffs, and the blue and yellow flowers, and see what I have brought you. Whereupon Heidi shook all her wealth of flowers out of her folded apron in front of her grandfather. But what a sight the poor little flowers made! Heidi no longer recognized them. They were all like hay, and not a single cup was opened. Oh, grandfather, what is the matter with them? Cried Heidi, quite shocked. They were not like that. Why do they look so now? They like to stand out in the sunshine, not shut up in your apron, said the grandfather. Then I will never bring any more home. But grandfather, what made the robber bird scream so? Asked Heidi urgently. You must jump into the water now, while I go to the shed and fetch the milk. Afterwards we go into the house together and have supper. Then I will tell you about it. So it was. And later, Heidi sat on a high stool before a little bowl of milk. Next to grandfather, she asked again the question, "Why did the robber bird keep croaking and screaming so, grandfather?" "He's mocking at the people down below, because so many sit together in the villages and make one another wicked. So he mocks at them. It would be much better for you to leave one another and let each go his own way, climb up to some mountain top, as I do." Grandfather spoke these words so wildly that the robber bird's screaming came back to Heidi's mind still more impressively. "Why have the mountains no names, father?" asked Heidi again. "They have names," he replied. "If you can describe one to me so that I can recognize it, I will tell you what it is called." Then Heidi described the rocky mountain with its two high towers, just as she had seen it. The grandfather, well pleased, said, "Very good. I know it. It is called Falkner. Did you see any more?" Then Heidi described the mountain with the big snowfield, which had been on fire, then turned rose color, and then suddenly grew pale and wan. "Oh, I know that too, grandfather. That says Aplana. So it pleased you up in the pasture, did it?" Then Heidi told him about everything that had happened throughout the day. How lovely it had been. She asked her grandfather to tell her where the fire at evening had come from, for Peter had not known anything about it. "You see," grandfather explained, "the sun does it. He says good When he says good night to the mountain, he sends to them his most beautiful ways, so that they may not forget him till he comes back again in the morning." This pleased Heidi, and she could hardly wait for another day to come, so that she could go up to the pasture and see once more how the sun said good night to the mountain. But first she had to go to sleep. She slept soundly the whole night, long on her bed of hay, dreamed of bright, shining mountains, the red roses, in the midst of which Sneehopely merrily ran and jumped. Chapter 4. At the Grandmother's. On the following morning the bright sun appeared again, and Peter came with his goats, and they all went together up to the pasture. So it happened day after day. Heidi grew very brown and strong and healthy from this outdoor life. She was as happy as the merry little birds in all the trees in the green woods. It was now autumn. The wind was beginning to blow louder over the mountain. So the grandfather said one day, "You must stay here today, Heidi. The wind with one puff could blow a little thing like you over all the rocks down into the valley." When Peter heard this in the morning, he looked very unhappy, for he saw real misfortune before him. He did not know how to pass the time. It was so tedious when Heidi was not with him. He missed his hearty dinner. Moreover, the goats were so contrary these days that he had twice as much trouble with them. They were so accustomed to Heidi's company that they would not go along, ran off in every direction because she was not with them. Heidi was never unhappy, for she always found something about her to enjoy. She would have preferred to go with Peter and the goats to the pasture, the flowers, and up to the robber bird, where there were so many things to do, with all the different goats. Still, grandfather's hammering and sawing and carpentering were very interesting to Heidi. It pleased her that he was just preparing the pretty round goat cheeses. Since she had to stay at home, it was particularly delightful to watch the remarkable operations of her grandfather as he bared both arms and stirred the cheese in the big kettle. But more attractive than all else to Heidi on such windy days was the roaring and rushing in the old fir trees behind the hut. Wherever she happened to be, she had to run to them every little while, for nothing was so fascinating and wonderful as this deep, mysterious sound up in the treetops. Heidi would stand under them and listen. She was never tired of seeing and hearing how the wind roared and rocked the trees with such might. The sun was no longer hot as in summer, but Heidi brought out her shoes and stocking, and also her little coat, for it grew cooler and cooler, and she stood under the fir trees. The wind blew through her as if she were a thin leaf, but she kept running back again and could not stay in the house when she heard the wind. Then it grew cold. Peter breathed on his hands when he came early in the morning, but not for long, for suddenly, one night, deep snow fell. The sun rose, the whole elm was white, not a single green leaf was to be seen anywhere about. After this, Orchard Peter came no more with his flock. Heidi looked with amazement out of the little window, for it was beginning to snow again. Big flakes fell thick and fast, till the snow came up to the window, then still higher, till they could not open the window, and they were completely buried in the little house. This made Heidi so merry that she kept running from one window to the other to see how it was increasing and whether the snow would cover the entire hut, so that they would need to have a light in the middle of the day. It was not so bad as that. The following day the grandfather went out with his shovel, for the storm was ended. He piled up great heaps of snow, so that there seemed to be mountains of it all around the hut. Now the windows and the door were free, and it was fortunate, for as Heidi and her grandfather were sitting in the afternoon on three-legged stools, suddenly there was a great knocking, stamping against the threshold. Finally the door opened. It was Peter the goatherd. He had not kicked against the door through rudeness, but in order to beat off the snow from his shoes. Indeed, Peter was covered with snow, for he had been obliged to struggle through the high drifts, so that great lumps remained clinging to him, frozen fast by the sharp cold. But he had not given up, for he was anxious to reach Heidi, whom he had not seen for a whole long week. "Good afternoon," said he as he entered, then placed himself as near as possible to the fire, and made no further remark. But his whole face beamed with pleasure at being there. Heidi looked at him wonderingly, for now that he was so near the fire, he began to thaw all over, so that he looked like a little waterfall. "Well, General, how are you?" asked the grandfather. "Now you're without an army, and must bite your slate pencil." "Why must he bite a slate pencil, grandfather?" asked Heidi at once with curiosity. "In winter he has to go to school," explained the grandfather. "There you learn to read and write, and often it's hard work, so it helps a little if you bite your slate pencil. Isn't it so, General?" "Yes, it is so," said Peter. Heidi's interest in the matter was now aroused. She had to ask Peter a great many questions about the school and everything that happened, was to be seen and heard there. As much time was always spent in any conversation in which Peter was obliged to take part. The result was that meanwhile he was able to get well dried from top to toe. It was always a great effort for him to put his thoughts into words, to express his meaning, but this time it was unusually difficult, for he had scarcely succeeded in giving one answer, before Heidi put 2 or 3 more unexpected questions, mostly such as required a whole sentence in reply. The grandfather had kept quite still during this conversation, but the corners of his mouth had twitched with amusement. This was a sign that he was listening. "Well, General, now you have been under fire and need strengthening. Come stay to supper with us." Whereupon the grandfather rose, brought the evening meal from the cupboard. Heidi pushed the stools to the table. Next the wall, there was still another seat, which the grandfather had made and fastened there. Now that he was no longer alone, he had fashioned here and there all sorts of seats for 2, for Heidi had a way of always keeping near him, wherever he went. So they all 3 had good seats. Peter opened his round eyes very wide when he saw what a big piece of the fine, dried meat the uncle laid on a thick slice of bread. Peter had not had anything so good for a long time. The pleasant meal was over. It began to grow dark, and Peter started for home. When he had said, "Good night, God bless you," he was already in the doorway, turned round once more and said, "Next Sunday I will come again, a week from today. You must come to my grandmother's sometime. She said so." It was a new idea to Heidi that she should go to visit someone, but it took root on the spot. The following morning, Heidi's first words were, "Grandfather, I must really go down to the grandmother's. She expects me." "There is too much snow," replied the grandfather, putting her off. But the purpose was deeply seated in Heidi's mind. After that, not a day had passed, and Heidi did not say 5 or 6 times, "Grandfather, I must really go. The grandmother is expecting me." On the 4th day, when the cold was so bitter that it cracked and creaked with every footstep outdoors, and the whole covering of snow was frozen hard all about, yet the beautiful sun looked in at the window, Heidi, as she sat in her high stool, eating her dinner, began her little speech again. "Today I must really go to the grandmother's. She will be tired of waiting for me." Then the grandfather rose from the dinner table, went up to the hayloft, brought down the thick bag that served as Heidi's bed covering, and said, "Well, come along." The child was greatly delighted, and skipped after him out into the glistening world of snow. In the old fir trees it was now quite still. The white snow lay on every bough. The trees sparkled and shone all over in the sunshine, so gloriously that Heidi jumped up and down with delight and kept exclaiming, "Come out, grandfather, come out! The fir trees are all covered with real silver and gold." The grandfather had gone into the shop, now came out with a white sled. It had a handle fastened to the side. From the low seat one could hold the feet out in front against the snowy ground and steer with one or the other in the required direction. After the grandfather had first looked all around the fir trees with Heidi, he seated himself on the sled, took the child in his lap, wrapped her up on the back so that she might be warm and comfortable, and held her tight with his left arm, as this was very necessary for the coming journey. Then, with his right hand, he seized the handle, gave a push with both feet. The sled shot away down a mountain with such swiftness that Heidi thought she was flying through the air like a bird, and shouted with joy. Suddenly the sled stood still in front of Peter the goatherd's hut. The grandfather put the child on the ground, unwrapped her covering, and said, "Now go in. It begins to grow dark. Come out again, and start along on the way home." Then he turned round with his sled, and drew it up the mountain. Heidi opened the door and went into a little room, which looked black. There was a fireplace in it, and some bowls on a stand. This was the kitchen. Then came another door, which Heidi also opened. This led into a small sitting room. For this was not a Swiss cottage, like a grandfather's, one single large room and the loft above it, but a very old little house, where everything was small, narrow, and shabby. When Heidi stepped into the little sitting room, she stood right in front of a table, by which sat a woman in his jacket. Heidi immediately recognized it. In the corner sat an old bent grandmother spinning. Heidi knew at once who she was. She went straight to the spinning wheel and said, "How do you do, grandmother? I have come to see you. Did you think it was a long time before you came?" The grandmother raised her head and sought for the hand held out to her. When she found it, she felt of it for some time thoughtfully. Then she said, "Are you the child staying up with the uncle? Are you Heidi?" "Yes, yes," replied the child. "I have just come down with my grandfather on the sled." "Is that possible? Your hand is so warm. Say, Brigitte, Did the alm uncle himself come down with the child? Peach's mother, Brigitte, who was mending by the table, had risen, was now examining the child with curiosity from head to foot. Then she said, I don't know, mother, whether the uncle himself came with her or not. It is not likely. The child may be mistaken. But Heidi looked straight at the woman and said sturdily, I know very well who wrapped me up in the coverlet and brought me down on the sled. It was my grandfather. Then there must be something in what Peaches said last summer about the alm uncle. Although we thought he was not right, said the grandmother. Who could really have believed that such a thing was possible? Thought the child wouldn't live 3 weeks up there. How does she look, Brigitte? Brigitte had studied her so thoroughly in the meantime that she could well describe her as pure. She has a delicate form like Adelheid, she replied, but she has black eyes and curly hair like Tobias, and also like the old man up there. I believe she looks like them both. Meanwhile, Heidi was not idle. She had looked around and noticed everything. Now she said, See, grandmother, there's a shutter that keeps swinging back and forth. My grandfather would drive in a nail at once to hold it fast. It will break a pane of glass. See, see. Oh, you good child, said the grandmother. I cannot see it, but I can hear it, and much more besides the shutter. Everything creaks and rattles when the wind blows, and it comes in everywhere. Everything is loose, and often in the night, both the others are asleep, so anxious and afraid lest the whole house should tumble down over our heads, kill us all three. There is no man to mend anything about the hut, for Peter doesn't know how. But why can't you see how the shutter swings, grandmother? See, there it goes again. There, there, there. Heidi pointed with her finger directly toward the place. Ah, child, I can see nothing at all. Nothing at all. Shutter or anything else, said the grandmother mournfully. But if I go out and open the shutter wide, so that it will be quite light, can you see then, grandmother? No, no, not even then. No one can make it light for me again. But if you go out in the white snow, then it will surely be light for you. Just come with me, grandmother. I will show you. Heidi took the grandmother by the hand to lead her out, for she was beginning to be distressed because it did not seem light anywhere to the old dame. Let me sit still, good child. It would be dark to me, even in the snow and in the light. My eyes cannot see. But then in the summer-time, grandmother, said Heidi, still anxiously seeking some way out of the difficulty. You know, when the sun comes down quite hot, then says good night to the mountain, and they shine fiery red, and all the yellow flowers glisten, then it will be light to you, won't it? Ah, child, I can never see them any more. Fiery mountain, golden flowers above us will never more be bright to me under, never more. Then Heidi burst into loud weeping. Full of distress, she kept sobbing. Who can make it light again for you? Can no one? Can no one at all? The grandmother tried to comfort the child, but she did not soon succeed. Heidi hardly ever cried. When she once began, it was almost impossible for her to recover from her grief. The grandmother had tried every means to soothe the child, but went to her heart to have her sob so pitifully. Finally, she said, Come, dear Heidi, come here. I want to tell you something. When a person cannot see, it is so pleasant to hear a friendly word. I like to hear you talk. Come sit down near me. Tell me what you do up there and what your grandfather does. I used to know him well. For many years I have heard nothing about him, except through Peter. But Peter doesn't say much. Then a new idea came to Heidi's mind. She quickly wiped away her tears and said comfortingly, Just wait, grandmother. I will tell my grandfather all about it. He will make it light for you again. He will fix the hut so that it won't tumble down. He can make everything all right. Grandmother remained silent. Then Heidi began with great liveliness to tell her about her life with her grandfather, the days she spent in the pasture, about her pleasant life in the winter, what her grandfather made out of wood, benches and stools and lovely cribs to put hay in for Schwänli and Bärli, the large new water tub for bathing in summer, the new milk bowl, the spoon. Heidi grew still more eager in describing the beautiful things which were made out of a piece of wood, how she stayed near her grandfather and watched him, and how quickly he did everything. The grandmother listened with great interest, time to time interrupted her with, "Do you hear that, Brigitte? You hear what she says of the uncle?" Suddenly the story was interrupted by a great thumping at the door, and in stamped Peter. The boy immediately stood still and opened his round eyes wide in astonishment at the sight of Heidi, and then a good-natured grin spread over his face as he said, "Good afternoon, Peter. Is it possible that he has already come home from school?" exclaimed the grandmother in surprise. "No afternoon for many a year has passed so quickly. Good afternoon, Peterly. How did you get on with the weeding?" "Just the same," answered Peter. "Dear, dear," said the grandmother with a little sigh. "I thought there might be a change. Think, I'll be 12 years old next February." "Why should there be a change, grandmother?" asked Heidi at once with interest. "I only thought he might be able to learn something," said the grandmother. "Learn to read, I mean. Up there on the shelf I have an old prayer book, beautiful hymns that I have not heard for so long that I cannot remember them. I thought if Peterly could only learn, he would perhaps be able to read some of the verses to me. But he cannot learn. It is too hard for him. I think I must get a light. It is already quite dark." Peter's mother had been busy mending the jacket all the while. The afternoon has gone before I was aware of it either. Then Heidi jumped up from her chair, quickly reached out her hand and said, "Good night, grandmother. I must go home right away if it is growing dark." Peter and his mother shook hands with her, one after the other, and accompanied her to the door. But the grandmother called out anxiously, "Wait, wait, Heidi. You must not go alone. Peter must go with you. Do you hear? Take care of the child, Peterly. Don't let her fall down or stand still with her, for she might freeze. Do you hear? And has she a good thick handkerchief round her neck?" "I have no handkerchief at all, but I shall not freeze," Heidi called back. Then she went out at the door and slipped away so quickly that Peter could hardly follow her. But the grandmother called anxiously, "Run after her, Brigitte, run! The child will be frozen out so in the night. Take my neckerchief. Run quickly." Brigitte obeyed. But the children had gone only a few steps up the mountain when they saw the grandfather coming down. In a moment he was with them. "Very good, Heidi," said he. "You have kept your word." He wrapped the coverlet round the child once more, took her in his arms, and climbed up the mountain. Brigitte saw this, and went back into the hut with Peter, told the grandmother in great surprise all about it. The grandmother was also surprised and kept saying, "God be praised, thanked that he is so good to her. God be praised and thanked. If you will only let her come to see me again. Oh, the child did me so much good. What a kind heart she has. How amusingly she talks." And until she went to bed, she kept repeating, "If she will only come again. Now there's something still left in the world to give me pleasure." Brigitte agreed with her every time. Peter nodded his head approvingly, stretched his mouth wide with delight, saying, "I knew it." Meanwhile, Heidi, wrapped in her bag, had much to say to her grandfather, but as her voice did not penetrate the eightfold wrap, and he could not understand a word, he said, "Wait a little until we get home. Then tell me about it." As soon as he reached the hut and had taken off Heidi's wrap, she said, "Grandfather, tomorrow we must take the hammer and the big nails that fasten the shutter to grandmother's house. We have a good many more nails, for everything creaks and rattles there." "Must? Must do so? Who told you that?" asked the grandfather. "Nobody told me so. I knew it without," replied Heidi, "for everything is loose. It makes the grandmother anxious and afraid when the wind blows. She can't sleep. She thinks now everything will fall down on our heads. Nobody can make it light any more for the grandmother. She doesn't know how anyone can. But you can surely, grandfather. Only think how sad it is for her to be always in the dark. And nobody can help her but you. Tomorrow we will go, won't we, grandfather?" Heidi clung to her grandfather and looked up at him with undoubting confidence. The old man gazed at the child for a little while, then said, "Yes, Heidi, we will make everything fast at the grandmother's hut. That there will be no more rattling. Tomorrow we will do so." Then the child jumped for joy all around the room and cried, "Tomorrow we will do it! Tomorrow we will do it!" The grandfather kept his word. The following afternoon they took the same ride on the sled. The old man set the child down before the door and said, "Now go in. It is night. Back." Then he laid the bag on the sled and went around the house. Scarcely had Heidi opened the door and run into the room, the grandmother called out from her corner, "Here comes the child! It is the child!" She dropped her thread and stopped the wheel for joy and held out both hands. Heidi immediately pushed a little low chair quite near, sat down in it, and had a great many more things to tell her and to ask her. But suddenly there was a heavy pounding on the house. It startled the grandmother so that she nearly upset the spinning wheel and, trembling, cried out, "Oh dear me, it's come at last! Heart is all tumbling to pieces." But Heidi held her fast by the arm and said consolingly, "No, no, grandmother, don't be afraid. This grandfather with his hammer. He's going to mend everything so that you won't be worried and afraid any longer." "Oh, is it possible? Is such a thing possible? So the dear Lord has not entirely forgotten us," exclaimed the grandmother. "Did you hear that, Brigitte? Did you hear what it is? It is really a hammer. Go out, Brigitte. If it is the arm uncle, tell him he must come in a moment and let me thank him." Brigitte went out. The arm uncle was just driving new fastenings into the wall. Brigitte went toward him and said, "I wish you good afternoon, uncle. So does my mother. I want to thank you for doing us such a service. And so does my mother indoors. Surely no one else would do such a thing for us. We want to thank you for surely—" "That will do," interrupted the old man. "What do you think of the arm, uncle? I already know. Just go back into the house. I can find out myself what needs to be done." Brigitte at once obeyed, for the uncle had a way which people did not usually oppose. He pounded and hammered all around the hut, then climbed a narrow little staircase up under the roof. He kept on hammering until he had driven the last nail he had brought with him. Meanwhile it had begun to grow dark. He had hardly come down and drawn his sled from behind the goat shed, and Heidi stepped out from the door. The grandfather wrapped her up in his arms, carried her as on the previous day, drawing the sled after him. Thus winter passed. After many long years, a joy had come into the blind grandmother's dreary life. Her days were no more long and dark, for now she always had something pleasant to anticipate. Early morning she listened for the tripping footsteps, and when the door opened and the child actually came dancing in, then she always exclaimed joyfully, "God be praised, she has come again." Heidi would sit down by her side, prattle and talk merrily about everything she knew, made the time pass so quickly that the grandmother did not notice it. Not once did she ask as formally, "Brigitte, the day nearly over?" Every time that Heidi closed the door behind her, she would say, "How short the afternoon has been, hasn't it, Brigitte?" And Brigitte would reply, "To be sure, it seems to me we have hardly put away the dinner plates." And the grandmother would say again, "Only the good Lord will preserve the child from me, and keep the arm uncle kind. Does she look well, Brigitte?" And every time Brigitte would answer, "She looks like a rosy apple." Heidi had also great fondness for the old grandmother. Whenever it came to her mind that no one, not even her grandfather, could make it light for her again, a great feeling of sorrow came over her. But the grandmother assured her that she suffered least when she was with her. So Heidi came down on the sled every fine winter's day. Grandfather, without making any objection, had brought her, always carrying his hammer and other things. He spent many an afternoon working about Peter's hut. It had a good result. There was no more creaking, rattling, and the grandmother said she should never forget the uncle, for she had not been able to sleep well for many a long winter. That was chapter 4, and with that we shall end today. Thank you very much for here today and for listening. I hope you will have a great day or a great night and that you were able to relax a little. I will see you next time on Saturday at the latest, maybe even before that, because I do want to finish Atelier Shelley quickly. Okay? Have a nice day. Remember to eat your veggies and be kind. Bye bye.